In June 1944, German generals were certain of one thing: American artillery was slow. Their reports mocked it as lumbering, imprecise, and too dependent on coordination. They believed speed was on their side: fast guns, fast tanks, fast war. But that confidence ended on the beaches of Normandy. When the Allies landed, the Germans expected confusion, chaos, silence between shots. Instead, the sky itself began to shake. Within minutes, hundreds of American guns opened fire in perfect rhythm, like an orchestra made of thunder. From the hedgerows to the coast, the ground quaked as steel screamed through the air. Every shell fell exactly where it was meant to, one after another, faster than thought, faster than breath. Villages vanished, roads split open, the night turned to daylight under fire. German officers stood staring at the horizon, unable to believe what they were hearing: not chaos, but harmony. The slow artillery they had mocked had become a machine of precision so relentless it sounded like a storm that would never end. And by the time the barrage stopped, the sky over Normandy was still glowing red. Because slow had just rewritten the meaning of speed. Before D-Day, German intelligence dismissed American artillery as clumsy and mechanical. Their reports called it too dependent on radio coordination, a weapon that moved like a factory, not a fist. The Wehrmacht prided itself on instinct, rapid decisions, fast movements, quick strikes. In their minds, war was a matter of reflex. But across the Channel, America was preparing something entirely different. It began with logistics, an art the Germans never fully understood. On the English coast, thousands of guns were lined up, calibrated, and tested with industrial precision. Each had its own crew, its own rhythm, its own code in the coming symphony of war. The soldiers didn't move fast, they moved together. In late May 1944, as the invasion fleet gathered, German spotters along the French coast wrote routine reports. No unusual activity. They didn't see the math behind the silence. They didn't see the endless tables of range data, the synchronized firing schedules, the ammunition charts that stretched for miles. They didn't see an army rehearsing thunder. When the order came, the 6th of June 1944, the Americans unleashed something Europe had never heard before. Every battery, every gun, every ship off the coast fired in perfect unison. It wasn't chaos. It was structure. It was music written in fire. The Germans at first thought it was just naval bombardment, the usual pre-landing shelling. But within minutes, they realized something was different. The rhythm didn't break. There were no gaps. Every second, somewhere, something was exploding. In the hedgerows near St. Lo, a German forward observer screamed into his field radio, "They are not firing like humans." The artillery map on his table was shaking from the shockwaves. The dust was so thick he couldn't read his coordinates. The American artillery wasn't simply shooting, it was calculating. Behind the beaches, entire networks of spotters and mathematicians worked with slide rules and maps, relaying coordinates faster than the Germans could react. Targets were marked, corrected, and destroyed in seconds. When one battery paused to reload, another took over its pattern so the sound never stopped. To the Germans, it felt like the earth itself had joined the invasion. The slow artillery they mocked had become a wall of motion, a moving storm of steel. One officer later wrote, "It was not a barrage, it was a tide." The effect was psychological as much as physical. German tank crews refused to move during bombardments. Radio lines broke down under panic. Even veteran troops froze, waiting for the impossible lull that never came. By the end of the first day, the artillery crews soaked in sweat, black with powder, were still firing. They had burned through thousands of shells, and they were still calm. They knew every range by heart. They could adjust for wind by instinct. They were slow only because perfection takes time, and perfection was killing faster than speed ever could. In one German command bunker near Caen, a general shouted, "Why do they not stop to aim?" A captured artilleryman later answered that question perfectly. "We don't stop to aim, sir. We've already done the math." The Germans had built their war on movement. The Americans had built theirs on momentum, and when those two ideas collided in Normandy, the sky itself became the battlefield. When the first shells fell on Normandy, they didn't sound like war. They sounded like a storm tearing the world open. At 5:30 on the 6th of June 1944, the night sky flashed white over the French coast. American battleships and field guns opened fire in perfect synchronization. 1,600 guns from sea to shore, each one already pre-sighted, pre-measured, pre-planned. The Germans had expected chaos. What they got was choreography. Inside German command bunkers near Omaha Beach, officers shouted over the static of broken radios. "They're firing blind!" one yelled, but they weren't. Every gun, every shell, every detonation was part of a pattern too vast for the human eye to see. The Americans had turned mathematics into murder. From the beaches, Marines and infantry watched the horizon burn. It was like the sun rose early, one soldier remembered, but it was made of explosions. The ground shook so violently that trees fell without being hit. Waves of concussion rippled inland, knocking birds from the sky. The Germans had built fortifications they thought could outlast anything, concrete bunkers 6 feet thick, dugouts buried in rock. But the shells weren't just hitting them, they were peeling them open. Each gun crew worked like a machine. Fire, adjust, reload, repeat. The order never changed. In the fields behind the beachheads, the M7 Priests' self-propelled American howitzers fired until their barrels glowed red. Men poured water over the metal just to keep them from warping. It turned instantly to steam. And still, they didn't stop. German spotters tried to locate the batteries. They couldn't. The guns fired and moved again, leapfrogging forward with every mile gained. The German system, built on fixed positions and predetermined fire plans, was collapsing under something they'd never faced before, an enemy that could think faster than they could aim. At 9, on the bluffs overlooking Omaha, the 352nd Infantry Division attempted a counterattack. They barely made it 10 minutes. Allied observers caught the movement, radioed coordinates, and within 90 seconds, the fields they were advancing through vanished under artillery fire. Survivors described it as the ground dissolving. The American system didn't rely on guesswork. It relied on communication. Spotter planes circled high above, calling targets. Radios buzzed in the hands of forward observers hiding behind hedgerows. Within seconds, a battery miles away adjusted its range, its fuse, its angle, and the next explosion found the mark exactly. It wasn't brute force anymore. It was precision on a continental scale. To the Germans, it felt supernatural. "We could not see them," one officer wrote. "We could not reach them, but they always knew where we were." By afternoon, entire regiments were pinned by fire they couldn't locate. The beaches that morning had been chaos, but by noon, that chaos had become rhythm. The guns had taken control. Artillery officers joked darkly that they could tell time by the pattern of explosions. "Every 10 seconds, another German position erased," one said. But to the men on the ground, both sides, it didn't feel like jokes anymore. It felt like the earth itself had joined the invasion. The German commander near Point du Hoc radioed a message that day that historians would later call the last line of arrogance. "The Americans fire too much and too wide. Their ammunition will not last." It did. By the next morning, the same German position no longer existed. In the days that followed, the artillery didn't slow. It learned. The Americans began using rolling barrages, curtains of fire that moved forward at walking speed, shielding infantry behind explosions. It was an old World War I tactic, but now perfected with radios, math, and machines that never misfired. German infantry called it the Wall of Thunder. They wrote home that the air is metal, the ground is liquid. At night, the horizon never went dark. Shells traced orange arcs across the sky, lighting up clouds from below. Locals hiding in cellars said the heavens looked alive, a sky of moving veins, each pulse another explosion. "The whole world was on fire," one French villager said later. "You could read a book by the light of their guns." In one sector, near Carentan, a single American artillery battalion fired 10,000 rounds in 12 hours, an average of one shell every 4 seconds. When they finally paused, the silence itself frightened them. "Every time we stopped," one gunner said, "you could hear the wind again." And that was worse. To the German generals, the speed wasn't in the guns, it was in the thinking. The Americans weren't guessing where the enemy was. They were predicting it. Artillery had stopped being reaction and become anticipation. By the end of the week, even Hitler's most trusted officers had stopped calling American artillery slow. They had found a new word for it, inevitable. By the second week of June, the sound of artillery had become the language of Normandy. Every hill, every hedgerow, every village carried the echo of guns. Even when they fell silent for a few minutes, men still flinched, hearing phantom blasts in their bones. The German generals could no longer track what was happening. Their maps were lines erased by craters that hadn't existed yesterday. Divisions reported broken contact not because they'd retreated, but because they'd stopped existing. From the air, Allied reconnaissance crews photographed what looked like patterns of light spreading through the countryside fields, chewed into constellations of impact. One pilot radioed down, "It looks like the Earth is glowing." At American artillery command posts, order didn't look like chaos. Dozens of officers hunched over maps and radios, calling coordinates in calm voices, adjusting guns by the meter. Outside, the crews moved in rhythm, ramming shells, slamming breeches, ducking under recoil. They worked without shouting, like a ritual rehearsed beyond exhaustion. The barrels smoked white, the air smelled of powder and sweat, and every few minutes a breeze carried the faint metallic taste of war toward the sea. The secret wasn't just the guns, it was communication. The US had built a nervous system that reached from the beaches to the battleships offshore. A spotter in a farmhouse could call down the fire of an entire fleet. A lieutenant with a radio could flatten a hillside in less than 2 minutes. The Germans, used to centralized command, couldn't comprehend it. Their artillery waited for orders that never came. The American guns didn't wait for anything. Near Saint-Lô, a German battalion tried one last counterattack at dawn. They moved through the morning mist, confident that the fog would hide them. But American radar had already marked the movement. Within moments, the fog itself began to flash. Shells ripped the air, lighting the mist from within. Men screamed, horses bolted, radios went, dead. When the smoke cleared, the field was gone. A German officer whispered to his aide, "They see through the clouds." By mid-June, even veterans who had fought in Russia said they had never witnessed anything like it. The Eastern Front had been brutal, chaotic. Normandy was precise annihilation. Every shell had a purpose. One survivor said later, "We fought men who used artillery like mathematics." To the Allied soldiers moving behind the barrage, it was salvation. The rolling fire cleared hedgerows and crossroads ahead of them. They learned to walk in step with the rhythm of the guns, 30 seconds between volleys, 40 yards between explosions. When the barrage lifted, they advanced through smoke so thick they could taste it, and by the time the enemy dared to raise their heads, the next wall of fire was already falling. Farmers' fields turned to moonscapes. Cows, trees, fences, all flattened into one grey plain. The men joked that Normandy wasn't France anymore. It was artillery country. At night, the spectacle grew biblical. Tracers from anti-aircraft guns stitched across the darkness. Artillery flares hung like false stars. Shells arced overhead, trailing sparks that glowed for miles. A war correspondent watching from a hillside wrote, "It's as if someone tipped the heavens and poured the fire out." Inside a German command post near Caen, General Marx pounded the table as another liaison officer reported entire batteries wiped out. "They cannot be firing that fast," he shouted, but his staff had no answers. Supply convoys couldn't move. Every road they tried was under constant bombardment. The Americans had built a wall of explosions that shifted like a living thing. The few survivors who escaped the barrages stumbled through craters wide enough to swallow trucks. One described walking through a landscape without color. Everything was gray, black, or burning. Meanwhile, the American crews barely noticed what they were doing to history. They just kept firing. Some hadn't slept in 40 hours. One lieutenant scribbled in his notebook, "We are the heartbeat now. If we stop, the line dies." On June 13th, the Germans launched one of their last hopes, the Panzer Division, against the Allied bridgehead. They expected to crush the beachhead before the artillery could reposition, but the guns were already waiting. Spotter planes marked the columns with smoke, and within minutes, every road leading north erupted. Tanks vanished under direct hits. Supply trucks flipped end over end. From above, pilots reported lines of fire crawling across the earth. When night came, the horizon glowed orange for 30 miles. The thunder never ceased. A German private in the rubble of a farmhouse looked at his captain and said, "The sky is falling." The officer didn't correct him. By dawn, Panzer had ceased to exist as an organized force. Hundreds of wrecks smoldered across the French countryside. From the cliffs near Omaha, American observers could see the reflection of their own fire in the clouds. It looked like the heavens were burning. One of them, a young lieutenant from Iowa, wrote home that week, "They called our guns slow, but out here, time itself moves at the pace of our shells." The German generals who had mocked American artillery never wrote again. Their command posts had been erased, some by direct hits, others by the collapse of the ground above them. In the chaos that followed, one surviving message was intercepted by Allied codebreakers. It read, "The enemy's fire does not come from guns, it comes from everywhere." And that was the truth. In Normandy, for the first time, artillery had become omnipresent, fast, invisible, inevitable. It was no longer the hand of the army, it was its voice. And that voice spoke only one word: advance. By late June 1944, Normandy no longer sounded like a battle. It sounded like a machine that had forgotten how to stop. The guns didn't pause between barrages anymore. They spoke in layers, naval fire pounding from the sea, field artillery roaring inland, mortars whispering through hedgerows. The entire front pulsed with rhythm. The Germans had built their defense on precision. The Americans had built their offense on infinity. From Caen to Saint-Lô, every road, every ridge, every orchard was under constant bombardment. Men stopped counting explosions because counting meant believing it would end. In one village south of Omaha, a German officer named Hauptmann Kramer ordered his men to hold their position at all costs. By midday, he couldn't find them. The street he'd been defending had disappeared, swallowed by overlapping craters. The map he clutched was useless, his coordinates were gone. He wrote a single line in his journal before losing consciousness: "The earth is louder than God." At American command posts, gunners moved with robotic precision. Every gun crew had its own world, a circle of mud, brass, and heat. Shell casings piled in golden mountains beside the barrels. Sweat turned to salt lines on their sleeves. Hands bled where gloves had burned through, but no one stopped. A sergeant shouted ranges. The crew answered in perfect unison, and the next shot vanished into the horizon. The sky responded with fire. From a distance, Normandy looked like it was breathing light. Every few seconds, a new flare arced upward, followed by the deep rolling boom of impact. Smoke drifted across the fields in thick curtains, glowing orange from within. Farmers' orchards, church towers, even the sea all reflected the same infernal hue. Civilians hiding in cellars prayed the light would fade. It didn't. For days, it stayed pulsing, flickering, alive. The Germans who tried to retreat found the roads already marked. Spotter planes and forward observers had turned the countryside into a grid. If you moved, you died. If you stayed still, you burned. Every vehicle was a target. Every shadow was watched. The artillery no longer needed to see you. It only needed to know you existed. General Rommel himself witnessed it from his car near Liverpool before being driven back by the bombardment. He told his staff, "It is not artillery. It is a factory of fire." The phrase spread through the German ranks like a curse. The factory of fire. That's what they called it now. At night, soldiers lay in foxholes staring upward. The sky flickered non-stop, white, orange, red, until their eyes couldn't tell whether it was dawn or dusk. The heat rolled over them in waves, carrying the smell of earth and fuel. "We thought hell was underground," one survivor said later. "Then we looked up. The Americans didn't see it as hell. To them, it was order proof that training, planning, and endurance could crush even the most fortified army. Every shell that left a barrel was another heartbeat in the anatomy of victory. We were the metronome," one gunner said. Every explosion meant the infantry could breathe, and the infantry moved mile by mile, crater by crater through a landscape that looked like another world. The hedgerows were gone. Rivers had changed course. The soil itself had turned to powder. Normandy was unrecognizable. By early July, the Germans had lost their grip entirely. Supply lines were severed. Commanders couldn't issue orders because radio towers had been flattened. Tanks that tried to maneuver bogged down in earth, softened by days of constant shelling. The once proud panzer divisions were reduced to isolated pockets, cut off, deaf, blind. One German general, standing outside what was left of his headquarters near Caen, said quietly to his adjutant, "We have been defeated by arithmetic." That night, the last coordinated German counterattack began and ended within 20 minutes. The artillery picked them up before they even reached the line. The horizon erupted. and for a moment it looked as if the clouds themselves were catching fire. From the coast, sailors aboard Allied destroyers watched the inland glow reflect across the waves. It looked like the land was on fire from the inside, one recalled, like the bones of the earth were burning. By dawn, Normandy was silent again, but not peaceful. Smoke drifted in columns to the sky, where the clouds still glowed faintly red. The birds didn't return. The rivers ran black. Even the wind carried a low hum, as though the island of France itself was remembering what had happened. The Germans had mocked American artillery as slow, methodical, and unimaginative. But on the fields of Normandy, it had moved faster than thought, an engine of precision that turned the concept of speed upside down. When prisoners were finally rounded up, one captured German lieutenant looked at his captors and said, "We fired faster. You fired forever." He wasn't wrong. For the rest of the war, that memory followed them, the endless sound, the red sky, the knowledge that once American guns began to fire, the only thing left to do was endure until they stopped. And for the men who fought beneath that sky, both those who lived and those who didn't, Normandy became a symbol of something larger than battle. It became the moment the industrial age learned to roar. The Germans had thought the Americans were slow, but they hadn't understood that slow, in America's hands, meant unstoppable. When the final German counterattacks broke apart under the storm, the battle for Normandy stopped being a clash of armies. It became an execution carried out by mathematics. The guns had found their perfect rhythm, not too fast to overheat, not too slow to let the enemy breathe. Every shell fell as if guided by an invisible metronome. The fields glowed white at the edges, and the villages in between flickered like dying candles. From high above, Allied reconnaissance planes captured the sight, an entire horizon pulsing with explosions, each burst blooming in sequence, mile after mile. One pilot radioed down, "The whole sky is on fire." On the ground, the Germans were trapped inside the music of their own destruction. Orders came too late, maps meant nothing, and every attempt to regroup was met with a fresh curtain of artillery fire. "You could not tell where the front was," one survivor said. The front was everywhere. Inside one shattered command post near Caen, a general stood in silence, listening to the roar outside. His adjutant whispered, "It's been hours, sir." The general shook his head. "No," he said. "It's been days." He wasn't wrong. For 3 days and nights, American artillery never fell silent. Crews fired until their hands blistered and their voices vanished. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. The rhythm had taken over. They became part of the weapon extensions of the steel barrels they fed. At the beaches, supply lines stretched endlessly, convoys of trucks carrying more shells, more powder, more fuel. The Americans weren't running out. They were accelerating. Every crate unloaded from the ships meant another minute of thunder inland. Normandy had turned into a living factory of destruction. To the Germans, it felt inhuman, as if the Americans weren't fighting a war but operating a storm. Tanks vanished under precision strikes that landed within meters. Infantry positions evaporated before they could dig in. Bridges were shattered moments after their coordinates were discovered. A soldier from the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "We no longer fight men, we fight their machines. They do not sleep, they do not stop, they burn the sky itself." By late June, smoke covered the land so completely that daylight turned amber. The sun was a faint disk above the haze. The rain that fell was black, filled with soot and ash. Yet even through it, the guns kept speaking. The sound rolled across Normandy like the breath of a giant. In some sectors, the artillery was so dense that explosions overlapped, blending into a single continuous roar. Civilians hiding in their basements called it the voice of God. Others said it was the sound of the world ending, and for many German soldiers, it might as well have been. Entire regiments simply disappeared. Communications broke down. In one moment, a radio crackled with a message. In the next, static. The operators never spoke again. The Allies didn't just destroy their enemies, they erased their presence from the map. At dusk on June 25th, the barrage reached its crescendo. American gunners along a 20-mile front received a single coded order. Fire for effect. Every gun on the line fired at once. The sound was beyond measure. The sky turned white, then orange, then red. The smoke rolled upward in colossal pillars, swirling together into a single burning canopy that covered the horizon. It wasn't the light of day or night, it was something in between, a permanent twilight made of flame. Men stopped fighting just to watch it. Even the Germans, huddled in their holes, stared upward at the heavens that had betrayed them. The sky itself burned, one prisoner said later. We thought the world had turned upside down. When the final volley fell silent, the quiet was almost unbearable. No birds, no shouts, only the ringing in men's ears and the soft hiss of the earth cooling. Normandy was no longer green. It was grey, black, and smoking. The smell of cordite hung heavy for miles. A reporter who arrived the next day wrote, "It was not a battlefield, it was the skeleton of one." In London, intercepted German transmissions told the rest of the story. "Our artillery cannot match theirs," one signal read. "We are destroyed before we can aim." The arrogance that once called American guns slow had turned into disbelief. Because what the Germans had failed to understand was this: America's strength wasn't in its guns. It was in its system, in men and machines that worked as one, in an army that could turn numbers into thunder and equations into victory. From that day on, every German officer in France knew the truth. You could outrun tanks, you could hide from aircraft, but once American artillery found you, you didn't run, you endured. And when historians later wrote of Normandy, they didn't just call it the greatest invasion in history. They called it the moment when technology and willpower fused into one, the moment when fire became organized. The sky over Normandy had caught fire, and it never went out. When the guns finally fell silent, the men could still hear them. Even in sleep, the sound followed deep, rolling, endless. The roar of Normandy had burned itself into memory. Weeks later, as the Allies pushed inland towards Saint-Lô and Caen, the battle changed shape, but the artillery didn't. It had become part of the landscape, a constant presence that no soldier questioned anymore. It spoke for them, defended them, announced them. The guns had become the language of victory. In captured German diaries, Allied intelligence found the same phrase repeated again and again: "The Americans fire faster than time." It wasn't an exaggeration. What the Germans had once called slow was actually method, the discipline of an industrial army that could plan, produce, and coordinate destruction on a scale the world had never imagined. For every gun on the front, a dozen more stood ready behind it. For every round fired, another was already on the way. It wasn't chaos, it was orchestration, and that was what broke the German command. After Normandy, German generals admitted in their post-war interrogations that they had underestimated American artillery more than any other weapon. They had prepared for tanks, for aircraft, for infantry assaults, not for precision fire that could erase an entire regiment before it fired back. One officer said simply, "We believed their firepower was mass, we learned it was intelligence." Normandy changed everything. The old idea of warfare, glory, maneuver, heroic duels vanished under the rhythm of industrial fire. From that point on, artillery became the heart of every modern army. The Americans had shown that victory didn't depend on how fast you moved, but on how precisely you could think. When the war ended, Europe still carried the scars. Farmers found shells buried in their fields for decades. The soil never quite forgot. Villagers remembered nights when the sky pulsed red and thunder came from every direction. Even now, historians call Normandy the place where the ground learned to speak. For the soldiers who lived through it, the memory never faded. Artillerymen wrote letters home, describing not the fear of combat, but the awe of coordination, of seeing entire hills vanish at a command spoken through static. One wrote, "I never saw the enemy, I only saw the math." The German survivors spoke of something else, a helpless respect. They fought with patience, one said. Their strength was not the shell, it was the silence between shells. In museums today, rusted artillery barrels from Normandy still bear the scars, steel warped from heat, engraved by fire. They stand as reminders of what happens when precision meets power. And yet, in the decades after the war, as the world rebuilt, the lesson of those guns remained quietly in every blueprint, every doctrine, every new invention of war. Computers, satellites, drones, all trace their lineage to those nights when American gunners turned numbers into fire. But for the men who pulled the lanyards, it was simpler. They didn't see history. They saw exhaustion, smoke, and the endless rhythm of loading and firing. They were not engineers or philosophers. They were laborers of thunder. A veteran of the 29th Infantry Division once stood on the beaches years later and said, "They called us slow, maybe we were, but slow is steady, and steady won the world." In Germany, after the war, surviving officers studied Allied tactics and realized something they had missed all along. The Americans hadn't built faster guns, they had built faster minds. Radios, math tables, logistics networks, those were the true weapons. The shell was only the messenger. And that was the legacy of Normandy. Not destruction, but understanding. That power without patience is noise, but patience with power is music. The sky that once burned over Normandy became calm again. The fields grew back. But every time the wind moves across those hills, it still carries a faint echo, a deep, rolling hum that feels like the earth remembering its heartbeat. Because once, for 3 endless days, the guns of freedom sang there, and they proved that sometimes the slowest weapons fire the fastest victories.